Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we may be having to add a late amendment to this bill to allow for names which fall under the category of animal cruelty, such as mozzarella. How any self-respecting animal can walk around with that name, I don't know. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm happy to take a call in the committee stage of this piece of legislation. Like members before me, I want to congratulate Simon Bridges on bringing this piece of legislation to the House. It's a little bit sad that, like a third former who's had his lunch money stolen, the Honourable David Carter came down and took it off him and is now touting it as his own. But I am pleased to see Simon Bridges taking a call on the House on this piece of legislation. And my colleague Stuart Nash made reference to the comment that Mr Bridges made that this is Parliament at its best. And I agree, it's always nice when we can get a piece of legislation we all agree on. But of course, maybe he wasn't here when he heard the speeches of Colin King and Sandra Gowdy, who decided to use this time to attack the opposition. It's nice to see Sandra Gowdy on side. I believe that she agreed to support the bill once she was reassured that mangroves aren't animals. And once that was explained to her, she was fine. But it was disappointing because we all agree that this is a good piece of legislation. We're all pleased to see it before the House. We've all been frustrated by the fact that higher penalties have been there in the past, but they haven't been used by the courts. The courts have gone with very low penalties. And I agree with Mr Bridges that I do hope that the courts take notice that Parliament is speaking with one voice on this particular issue, that we do want to see tougher penalties for animal cruelty, that we acknowledge the link between animal cruelty and other forms of violence in our society, and that we want to see those penalties significantly increased for these particular offences under the Animal Welfare Act. I noticed the Minister for iPads is in the chair, and I hope he's prepared to take a call and answer some questions that have been raised around the resourcing of this Act, because it doesn't matter how tough the penalties that you put in place are if they are not adequately resourced. And this has been a big issue in the past, and it's good that there's another $8 million in the budget for the policing of animal welfare legislation. But us on this side of the House, we'd quite like to see the $40 million that went to private schools also going towards the policing of animal welfare. It's good that the Minister was able to find more money in a tight budget, but actually they made some choices in their budget which wouldn't have been our priority, and more money could have come to this particular and important area. And when you look over history, 20 years ago, 1/3 of animal abuse prosecutions were taken by the police. 1/3. Today, the SPCA has to take 90% of them. And as members have said, they have to look for pro bono work. Often, when the court awards them money to pay for costs, it barely even begins to cover the cost of taking that prosecution. And so it's good that extra money has gone, but I hope that this will be watched very carefully, because we need to see the number of animal welfare complaints going on to prosecution increasing dramatically from the 0.4% that it's at today. 0.4% of animal welfare complaints go on to prosecution. And governments of all stripes, over the past 20 years have to look and take responsibility for that as well. And that's why Labor is also supporting this piece of legislation through the House today. I do have some questions of the Minister regarding in particular the distinction between willful ill-treatment of animals and reckless ill-treatment of animals, sections 28 and 28A under this Act. And I acknowledge the comments that were made by Sue Kedgley that this will make it easier, we hope, to get the prosecutions, because you no longer have to prove that someone intended to do it. What I sincerely hope is that we don't see a huge differential between convictions that happen under those two separate categories. I hope we don't see that people who go in for willful treatment of animals get treated significantly worse and have significantly harsher penalties than those under reckless ill-treatment of animals, because the prosecution may be taken under reckless ill-treatment only because you can't prove that it was a willful act. And it may well have been a willful act. But if the SPCA or the police or whoever is taking the case is not able to absolutely prove that, then obviously they'll go for reckless ill-treatment. But that doesn't mean that it was significantly worse. And it doesn't mean that the act wasn't willful. And while you will always have that difference, I hope we don't see a dramatic widening or a huge chasm between those two, where people who get prosecuted under reckless ill-treatment of animals actually get off really lightly, and people who end up getting charged under willful, because that's actually the situation we have now, which is where it's very difficult to get any kind of prosecution for people where you can't prove that act wasn't lawful. Mr Chair, Mr Chair, Mr Chair, Mr Chair.
I call
Chair.
David Shearer.